We now have to be in a mode of preventive work. The work that must be done to prevent a war in Iran is complicated. I saw some truly frightened people, truly, honestly frightened countries around the world that are saying, we got to do something about Syria. Let us work very hard at making sure that we don't ignite a nuclear holocaust. The Occupy movement really did a great job in raising the level of discussion and consciousness about this financial services industry and the politicians who simply are bought and paid for by them. Israel has nuclear capability. We don't want to think my nuclear weapon is better than your nuclear weapon. They're all bad. We have to be courageous. We have to make sure that we have on our agenda peace. Give some backbone to the politicians. Let me just tell you, it's like Old Home Week. I see women that I have worked with for the last, 30 years or so. And you look gorgeous. You look wonderful. Thank you so very much, Sabrina, everybody. I'm pleased that you invited me to be here this afternoon because, number one, I need to be connected again to the women who have given their lives to peace. Many of you go back for a long time, many years. And while I have been working on peace efforts in the Congress of the United States, I have not been on the street doing the kind of activism we used to do. When I received this invitation, I thought about Bella Abzug. And I thought about the travels that we did to Switzerland, I believe it was. I thought about some of the efforts that we made as activist women. And so I'm so pleased to be here because this is an important time to talk about peace. I know we were all getting very happy about the fact that we coming out of Iraq and we were going to come out of Afghanistan, but I want to tell you, we now have to be in a mode of preventive work. And I'm going to go through that a little bit right now, okay? First of all, let me just extend a warm thank you to all of my friends here with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It is a great honor to be here today to celebrate International Women's Day. You must know that my efforts for peace would be worth little without the support of all of you. Most of the greatest changes in the history of this country have come from grassroots organizations like ours and not from policymakers in Washington, D.C. You're committed public servants fighting on the front lines of our great democracy. Your tireless work and advocacy of peace alternatives to war will change the path of this country and ultimately the course of history. Over the past 10 years, the American people have endured two costly and devastating wars, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan. Yet I fear we may be on the verge of entering yet another war, this one with Iran. When we turn on our televisions at night, we hear saber rattling and calls for military action. Certain politicians and presidential candidates are trying to prove they're tough by demanding a hard line against Iran. This may appeal to some voters, but it will not lead to peace. Saber rattling never does. It has been over 10 years since Congress authorized President Bush's war in Iraq. No one would argue that Saddam Hussein was anything other than a brutal dictator, but the consequences of his removal apparently were never taken into consideration by the Bush administration. At the time, who would have thought we were being led into perhaps the worst foreign policy disaster in America's history? America's history. Well, I certainly had a pretty good idea when I urged my colleagues to oppose the authorization for war on October 7th of 2002. Thank you. Many members of Congress did vote against that war authorization, and many more members wish they had voted against it. The tragic mistake that Congress made in authorizing that war is all the more deplorable because of the now widely recognized fact that that war authorization was obtained through the use of propaganda, manipulation, and flat-out lies. When the Iraq War began in March of 2003, President Bush told the country it would be a swift and easy victory over Saddam Hussein's regime, and formation of a stable democratic government would naturally follow. He could not have been more wrong. President Bush and his military planners were ignorant of the problems that would be created by overthrowing Saddam's regime. Furthermore, President Bush failed to provide the nation with a plan for success in Iraq, and he could not even describe what success would look like. I joined together with my colleagues and friends. They call us the Triad. Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Congresswoman Lynn Woozing to form the Out of Iraq Congressional Caucus, and I fought day after day to end that war. We worked together to convince our colleagues that the incredible resources that were being dedicated to Iraq, both money and manpower, would be better spent at home making America stronger. These precious resources should have been dedicated to health care, affordable housing, and repairing our infrastructure. As the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, we made speeches, we organized rallies, we did everything within our power to bring the war to an end. Finally, last December, almost 10 years after the war was authorized by Congress, the last brigade of American combat soldiers left Iraq and returned home in time for Christmas. Can I get some water? Please. But the cost of the Iraq War in both money and lives has been enormous. A total of 4,488 of our brave men and women have perished, and an additional 32,223 have been wounded in action. Over $823 billion have been poured into the Iraq War effort. Meanwhile, the social and physical infrastructure of Iraq was decimated. Over 4 million Iraqi refugees fled their homes during the first 5 years of the war alone, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more were killed as a result of this unjust war. President Obama is now campaigning on the fact that he fulfilled his promise to bring our troops home from Iraq, but as we all know, not all of our troops are home. Thousands of our troops remain in Afghanistan. While many people have referred to the war in Afghanistan as the right war, it has turned into a prolonged conflict with no end in sight, placing a tremendous strain on our resources and our troops. U.S. troops continue to be injured and killed in combat, and the Taliban continues to find ways to undermine our strategy and delegitimize our credibility with the Afghan people. A total of 1,787 American soldiers have died in Afghanistan, and an additional 15,438 have been wounded in action. Over $557 billion have been spent on the war in Afghanistan. To make matters worse, I don't believe we have fully addressed what will constitute success in Afghanistan or what the long-term cost of success will be. We have not been able to successfully address Afghanistan's economic deprivation, political corruption, or social divisions. Despite our efforts over the past 10 years, Afghanistan still lacks long-term sustainable institutions and a credible democratic government. The cost of these two wars combined is staggering. We have spent more than $1.4 trillion on war funding since 2001, while 6,275 of our young men and women have been killed and 47,661 have been wounded in action. In addition to the actual monetary costs, I'm very concerned about the long-term mental health impacts frequent redeployments are having on our U.S. service members. It has been reported that the tremendous strain placed on the U.S. military from both Iraq and Afghanistan wars has led to an unprecedented epidemic. For last consecutive years, more veterans committed suicide than died in combat, according to the Department of Defense Manpower Data Center. Since 2001, military suicides have risen sharply as a result of the repeated deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan that many troops have been forced to endure. Moreover, the Army National Guard is in crisis, as Guard members are 42% more likely to return from deployments with mental illness than their active duty counterparts. The American public is just tired of war, and it is time to bring all of our troops home, all of them. It is time to begin investing our resources in rebuilding our communities, growing our economy, and creating jobs. It's time to invest in peace instead of war. Now, I do commend President Obama for resisting the temptation to join in the saber rattling against Iran. The president is trying to work with our allies and avoid war. We must encourage him. We must demand it. We must tell him to pursue all diplomatic alternatives to war. This past week, I joined my dear friend, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, to introduce H.R. 4173, the Prevent War from Acquiring Nuclear Weapons and Stop War Through Diplomacy Act. This bill directs the president to appoint a special envoy for Iran to ensure that all diplomatic avenues are pursued to avoid a war with Iran and to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. We cannot wait until after a new war begins to make our voices heard. I've learned over these years not to underestimate the power of informed, outspoken individuals like yourselves, and that power that it can have on our great country. You have taken to the streets and to the halls of Congress. You have made phone calls, written blogs, and distributed petitions. You have conveyed the powerful message of peace across the entire land, and the people of the United States have heard of you. Now we must renew our efforts. Together, we will end the war in Afghanistan and bring all of our troops home. Together, we will send a message of peace to all of our nation's leaders. Together, we will send a message of peace to all of the politicians whose saber-rattling threatens to force us into a whole new war. Together, we will bring about a new foreign policy based on peace and diplomacy. Together, we can and we will change the course of history. Let me just, before I wrap up, tell you that the work that must be done to prevent a war in Iran is complicated. AIPAC was in Washington, D.C. This past week, and I mean in huge numbers. The numbers were so huge that you couldn't get a taxi cab. You couldn't get anywhere because, the numbers were huge. And this is what I saw. I saw some truly frightened people. I mean, truly, honestly frightened. I saw others who were looking for leadership and looking for direction. And I saw those who wanted to hear what the vision was of not only the president, but the members of Congress. Please tell us. Please help lead us. Please help solve this problem. But I want to tell you that people like John McCain and others were literally saying, we've got to strike Iran. And it's so dishonest. it is such that it makes you absolutely think about politics in the worst way, because many of them are trying to build their reputations, collect money, and be seen as saving saving Israel from Iran. At the same time, they don't weigh the cost, not only to Israel, but to the entire Middle East and to the United States. And so, I think that we have to be courageous, and we have to say some of the things that the president said, that we are friends, we consider Israel one of our closest allies. We are concerned about your security and your safety, but let's use this window of opportunity that we have before they have the ability to really complete this development of a nuclear weapon. Let us understand that we have a little signal here where our inspectors are now able to go in. Let us work very hard at making sure that we don't ignite a nuclear holocaust. Ladies and gentlemen, Israel has nuclear capability.
600,000.
We have nuclear capability in India and Pakistan. And so what we don't want is, we don't want to think my nuclear weapon is better than your nuclear weapon. They're all bad. They're all bad. They're all dangerous to this entire earth. And so it's going to be hard to convince some of our friends to hold on, be patient. Let's do everything that we can possibly do in order to create peace through diplomacy and leveraging and sanctions. I understand the sanctions are beginning to work somewhat in Iran, that these sanctions have created an economic problem for Iran. How can they continue to hold on if, in fact, we are having an impact with these sanctions? Let's continue to exercise these sanctions. Let's make it very tough for them. Let's take a watch at what Iran is doing with Syria to make sure that we send a message that if you do not want to be involved with a strike from Israel, you'd better watch out what you're doing in Syria also. And so I think that the president is on the right track at this point. I really think he's on the right track. And I think that with his talk with Netanyahu, that he, even though it may not have looked like it, that he and Netanyahu really did come to an understanding that while we certainly have Israel's back, we're not prepared to go to war. We're not prepared to go to war at this time, and I think that they got that message across. I think that message, you know, sometimes when they come out to the public, and Netanyahu in particular, he has to really appear really, really tough. And he made his point. He said over and over again, we do not leave the decision about our security to anyone. And that's what, you know, people wanted to hear from him. You know, he knows what message to send in order to create some kind of sense of security of those people who are frightened. And so he did that. But believe me, behind closed doors, I'm sure that he said, Mr. President, we're worried. Mr. President, we're scared. We have scared people, but I hear you loud and clear. And I know that we're not going to simply take an action without the United States agreeing and supporting that action. And I guarantee you, the United States, with the deficit problem that we have, with these wars, with Afghanistan and with what has happened in Iraq, not prepared to go to anybody's war at this point. So I want us to figure out how we can be in a preventive mode, how we can support the idea that we can solve this problem without war, how we can help to give some backbone to the politicians and to speak out against McCain and others who are simply using this as a political tool. How we say to the president, you're on the right track. And how we hold all of our elected officials accountable. We're all up for re-election. This is 2012. And when we talk to them, despite the fact that we're still worried about unemployment and this economy and the housing market and all of that, we have to make sure that we have on our agenda peace, no war with Iran. Work this out diplomatically. And when your elected officials come before you and when you're engaging them in these town hall meetings and other kinds of meetings, make sure you have this on the agenda. I think we can do this. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do is find a way that we can create some activity and start to use the word prevention. Prevention. Remember, we've always used the word stop the war that's going on now, you know. But let's talk about how we can promote a discussion and build some language around preventing us from going into this war that some are saber-rattling around. When you talk about weapons of mass destruction free zone, let us not forget that there is chemical warfare possibilities with Syria. Now, the latest information that I've heard on Syria is that we're deploying someone to Syria to offer to assist Assad in getting out and giving up and getting out of Syria. Now, I don't know whether or not that's something he can be convinced to do. The devastation, the deaths are such that there's a growing coalition of countries around the world that are saying we got to do something about Syria. So I don't know whether or not it is possible to talk him out of leaving rather than a strike. There are a lot of people talking about a strike on Syria. John McCain and the rest of them want a strike. But if this can work, I think this will be very helpful in making sure that the chemical warfare possibilities from Syria will not happen. Let me tell you what frightens folks, and this is what we have to try and undo. When people listen to Ahmadinejad, they think that he's speaking for the policy of Iran, and he's not. One of the things we have to do is to unveil the backgrounds of the so-called leaders, who they are, what they represent, and who really has the power, and what the supreme leader is all about. I think we're going to have to do some of that kind of educating. AIPAC has a lot of power and a lot of influence. They raise a lot of money, and they raise money not just for re-elections, but also to see that the people who will support their agenda are in key places in all of the committees and all of the leadership of Congress. So they do exercise tremendous power. And I think that the more money you take from AIPAC, the more you get tied down to their policies. I do not accept contributions from AIPAC. These kinds of concessions and these kinds of decisions are made oftentimes because in this case, the president is saying we need to have diplomacy. We cannot guarantee you that we'll back you up if you strike, that kind of thing. And on the other hand, but let me give you something to make you feel that we love you and that we're with you. So don't be surprised that that kind of dealing is going on. Yes. My analysis that the Tea Party came out and made a lot of noise. They came to the Congress of the United States, they walked the halls, they barged into our offices, and they got a lot of attention. The press really wrote a lot about them because the press loves this kind of controversy. I don't believe they are as strong as the press would make you believe, and I think that they're not able to really have the influence that you would think they could have on the Republican Party because they now have moved to raise money in different ways to take on some Republicans who are not Tea Party enough for them. So they're taking on Republicans and Democrats. And what I'm saying is the amounts of money that they're raising are not huge amounts of money, but they're catching people off guard, like Jean Schmidt, who you might have read about, who just got knocked off. And I think they only spent about $50,000 in that race. She was not paying attention. She's a Republican. She was not Tea Party enough, and they did get her. But I don't think that you're going to see any great sweep of Tea Party members of Congress elected in 2012. I just don't believe that. Occupy, in my estimation, has had great influence on Congress and on the American people. And they have absolutely drawn a lot of attention to the too built to fail financial institutions in this country, where a lot of people have sat in their families and at home, you know, being absolutely angry at the banks and the credit cards and the charges and the fees and the foreclosures on properties that people were snookered into signing, all of that. And so I think that the Occupy movement really did a great job in raising the level of discussion and consciousness about this financial services industry and the fact that we need to do something about them and the politicians who simply are bought and paid for by them. Now, a lot of people are disturbed because they say they didn't have leaders. They didn't organize it right. And now, you know, they're not in the parks anymore. Where are they? What is happening? I don't think we should bemoan that. I really don't. And I don't think that we should try and impose our definition of leadership on them. I mean, we have a definition of leadership. We haven't done so good with it. You know what I'm saying? So I think that we should allow them. Yes, they've had an impact. What else is going to take place and how they're going to do it, I don't know. But I want to tell you something. In this election, 2012, where we've had a Citizens Commission that's done some of the reapportionment, it's going to make it a little bit difficult for some members who you would support to be reelected. And they have, my district is going to be a little bit more conservative. They've introduced me to the people of Torrance, California. And so it's a little bit different for me, okay? However, let me just say this. When I'm reelected, I have the #1 seniority on the Financial Services Committee. Barney Frank is retiring. I stand to be the chair of the Financial Services Committee. OCC, all of the financial services agency, and even have the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank all in that. So I want to tell you, and there's going to be an attempt to stop me from getting it. The big boys are going to roll in. I suspect that they will be behind the scenes supporting members of Congress not to vote for me. And, you know, in the final analysis, we kind of have a vote. It's really the leadership that directs that vote. But they're going to be putting a lot of money into the DCCC. you know, helping people to be reelected and trying to find a candidate to oppose me. Now, I'm lucky in that the next 4 people behind me are all supporting me at this point. They're all supporting me. And so we think that if we do our work, we get reelected, we have to give some support to the DCCC in helping to elect other people. And then the ethics committee that's been after me because I help minority banks, we think we've just about got them. They've recused themselves. They have some people who are taking the Fifth Amendment. And so we think that's going to work out fine. And if this all works and I get that chair, it's going to be a new day. And that, I think, not only is supported by the occupation movement, but this will give them more hope that it is possible to create change in the way that they have worked and what they have attempted to do, and they will have an open door to help deal with these. I want to tell you, there's so much work to be done, you know, as a Financial Services Committee, because not only, again, do we have oversight for all of that that I've just alluded to, all of these payday loan operations that are ripping off poor people, rent-to-own operations, and pawn your car operations, and all of these things we can get at, and I think that will give people a lot of hope. So we got work to do. Thank you all very much.